Welcome everyone to our special webinar at the Institute for Poverty, Land and Agrarian Studies at the University of Western Cape in South Africa. Our special webinar today is about military dictatorship and citizenship in Myanmar. It is now public knowledge that on the 1st February 2021, democratically elected government was toppled by a military coup in Myanmar. This webinar dissects the authoritarian regime and lays bare its destructive implications for citizens, and why this is not only a counter-democratic state of affairs, but a threat to democracies of the Global South. This webinar will talk to these questions. Is this the death of democracy in Myanmar? What are the authoritarian regime's implications for rural and urban populations? What does the current military dictatorship reveal about authoritarian regimes elsewhere in this age of capitalism? And what can be done by the international community? We have three speakers. Sai Samkam, who is a PhD fellow at the International Institute of Social Studies, Erasmus University, Rotterdam. And Fariba Alamgil, who holds a PhD in international development from the University of Copenhagen and University of East Anglia. And Shapan Adnan, who is a professor at the School of Oriental and African Studies, University of London. Our first speaker is Sai Samkam, followed by Shapan Adnan and Fariba Al-Malkil. Each speaker has 13 minutes, followed by 20 minutes of discussion after all speakers have spoken. Let us have our first speaker, Sai Samkam. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me in this seminar, and also thank you for participating in this seminar. I would like to share how I see the situation in Myanmar and what are unique about this resistance against the military dictatorship. And I would also try to look into what is the role of the rural area and how people are responding to the coup d'etat in Myanmar. And a lot of media analysis for now, what we are seeing regarding to the coup d'etat in Myanmar, has the analysis about the two leaders, the ousted NLD Miss Aung San Suu Kyi, and then the commander-in-chief Min Aung Hlaing. I mean, personalities are very important, in politics, but the resistance against authoritarian rule and dictatorship in Myanmar has a long history. And it's not only about these two people, it's much more than that. And after February 1st coup d'etat by Myanmar military, what we are seeing is the first resistance come from the medical doctors, that they call for the civil disobedient movement, that they refuse to go to the hospital. They try to provide healthcare services as much as they can in other arrangements, but they refuse to work at the hospital. So to remember that this is in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic, which is also a very big problem in Myanmar. So Myanmar has coup d'etat as a crisis, and then we also have COVID-19, and also armed conflict in the ethnic minority areas in Myanmar. So the medical doctors are also leading this to push that. And in Mandalay, a medical doctor called Dr. Teza San organized a small group of people to protest. So this is kind of like the first protest. And then the largest protest started in the capital city, Yangon, on 6th February. And this was led by the workers, factory workers and worker unions in Myanmar. And then, as we all know, there is a lot of creative protests in Myanmar. Initially very peaceful, and it seems that the government is also not, the military junta is also not responding it with violence in the beginning, but then it followed with very brutal crackdown that we are seeing today. So over 2,000 people are being detained, over 200 people are being killed in Myanmar, including as young as 7 years old girl shot at her house while she is sitting on the lap of her father. So we are seeing a very brutal crackdown against the uprising. And then what is very visible about this resistance against dictatorship in Myanmar is the younger generation, that they are often seen as, those more educated, that they have not seen dictatorship like my generation. They are much younger than me, that they love to play TV games and such. But overnight they become mature, and then they become leading this resistance also. And there is a lot of political awakening in Myanmar. And regarding to the ethnic divides, remember that Myanmar have a 70-year-long civil conflict. And then there is a lot of divides based on ethnicity and religion. But this coup d'etat brings people from different divides together. And then the Burma ethnic majority, the Burma Buddhist ethnic majority, are apologizing to the ethnic minority, including the Rohingya, that they now started to understand the brutality of the Myanmar military. And in this resistance, we are also seeing a lot of hope and expectation for the international intervention. For example, from the UN Security Council, and also US or other international interventions. But more and more people are started to realize that in the end, this is our struggle, that we have to own this struggle to shape the final outcome of it. So these are the things that we are seeing, quite fascinating, quite, tragic at the same time, also very hopeful. And as I talk about the 70-year-long civil war, which also means that Myanmar military have all these years of training themselves, equipping themselves, getting experience in their warfare, and it's very brutal. And I must say that it's like in a form of internal colonization to the ethnic minority area, which is characterized as rural, agrarian, and also resource-rich area. So on the one hand, you can see the territorialization of the rural area by the authoritarian regime. And then the current uprising that we are seeing, internal colonization of the urban area, in contrary to the previous internal colonization of the rural area. And in the analysis of the current crisis, I think I saw only one paper or an article talking about the class dynamic in the current conflict. So class analysis is largely missing in Myanmar politics. And understandably, successive governments are very much afraid of leftist, Marxist, communist political movement, because it play a very important role in Myanmar history. And again, it's also a very brutal and bloody history if we look at that. And we are seeing a class alliance between the Myanmar military, which is largely along the history in Myanmar, a ruling class, and then the way they are controlling the economy in Myanmar. So from the beer that the most popular beer that people drink every day, to the oil and gas sector, and to the telecommunication sector, Myanmar military is controlling the economy. And just to give you an example, an idea of their involvement in the Myanmar economy, one of the biggest Myanmar telecommunication service provider is called Mytel. It's a joint venture between Myanmar military-owned business and Vietnamese military-owned business, Viettel. And then if you look at Viettel, international financial institutions, including banks from England, are supporting Viettel. So you can say that Myanmar military business is also linked with the international finances. And just to give you an example, that Myanmar, that Mytel submitted a proposal to Myanmar Investment Commission, and then in that proposal, their projection of income within 10 years is $700 million US. And then from the oil and gas sector, to give you an example of 2017 and 2018 income from oil and gas alone is $696 million US, coming from Total, coming from Petronas, PTTEP, for example. So international finances and Myanmar military businesses are very much linked, and they play a very important role. And I think it's important for us to look at the production and reproduction of military dictatorship in Myanmar. And now a lot of the activism and the resistance against dictatorship is trying to hurt the military income. So a lot of the demands that in the international advocacy that you might heard is about targeted sanction, which I think is very important. But on the other hand, we would also need to think about how come a military dictatorship can last over 60 years in Myanmar, and how are they socially reproducing themselves? So these are the questions that I would like to ask. And then talking about this, I think it's important to look at the role of Buddhism in Myanmar also, providing, furthering Myanmar military's narrative and discourses, especially to look at the Burma Buddhist nationalism, which is kind of like the ideology, bedrock of the Myanmar military, that they fashion themselves as the protector of the nation and the protector of Buddhism. And before the coup, even we are seeing Buddhist nationalists are calling for coup d'etat. And then we are seeing the most prominent Buddhist monk in Myanmar called Sidagu Sayadaw calling for, accusing NLD of election fraud, for example. So we really need to understand the social reproduction and the role of Buddhism and other social institutions supporting the Myanmar military, so that they can rule the country over 60 years. So if you look at the history of Myanmar, it's like a joke that Myanmar people love to talk about. In 2010, the Myanmar military has changed their uniform into civilian, clothing, and fashioned themselves as a democratic transitioning government. And once the president Thein Sein, a former military general, visited a factory and asked the factory owner, "What about electricity here?" And then the factory owner was worried because there is frequent blackout, electricity blackout in Myanmar. It's one of the biggest challenge for a lot of the factory and production in Myanmar. But he's worried that there could be backlash. So he answered that, well, we have electricity quite often. So I think if you ask me about democracy and dictatorship in Myanmar, I think we have to say that, yes, we sometimes have democracy. So in 1962, 1988 are the previous military coup in Myanmar. So if I am to borrow from Barrington Moore's Jr., Social Origin of Dictatorship and Democracy, Myanmar is on the path of capitalist reactionary path, where military ruling class and the crony businesses are in the class alliance. What about my time?
You're still okay? Just please wrap up.
Okay. And then and then I will talk about I will continue. So we are seeing military ruling class, and during the 90s they started to open the country, and then we are seeing the booming of business investment sectors, foreign investment coming in, and then we are started seeing what we call in Myanmar crony capitalist class rising, and they are very important in Myanmar business. What is very interesting with the current crisis is it seems like this crony capitalist class is really seeing the problem of the military coup, and it looks like they are trying to resist that. For example, the private banks are kind of resisting to open, to listen to the coup council, and then some of them also refuse to go to some of the meetings invited by the military junta. Now, I would like to go to the question about how the farmers see the current coup. And we are seeing some blaming in social media that the military, that the rural population is not really coming out strongly to fight against the military coup. Some people are saying that we come out by the million in the big cities, but in the rural area, it does not seem like there is a strong movement. But in reality, the rural population also doesn't like it, because they have lived under this brutality of the military rule for so many years, But again, the politic in the urban area and rural politic is very different. In the rural area, people have to worry about military allies. We have different groups of ethnic armed organization as well as military allied militias in the rural area. So that's why you can see that in the rural area, people tend to vote for the military backup political party, the USDP party, because they have to be afraid of the militias who are forming an alliance with the Myanmar military. So they also play a very important economic role in the rural area also. So so that the political dynamic is very different. So if we are to talk about democratic transition in Myanmar, it's very important to look at the rural democratization. So far, whatever political debates in Myanmar, it's very much focused on ethnic politics, ethnic identity politics. And a lot of the political solution people talk about is ethnocentric federal democracy. But for me, I think it's very important that it's important to look at ethnic identity, but we have to go beyond that. And we really have to look into rural democratization. Otherwise, this class alliances between the military ruling class, crony capitalists, and the rural-based local militias, who control politics and economy there, will shape the politic. Whatever democracy or semblance of democracy that we are enjoying in the urban area, it's very different from the rural area. And Plus might know much better that like in many countries, the rural area also hugely face, the agrarian society face land grab, violence, conflict, over 400,000 people in Myanmar are internally displaced. And, more than 1 million Rohingya people are in Bangladesh, which Fariba and Shapan might talk about later, will talk about later. And we still have a large population of ethnic minority in Thailand as refugees. So these are important things. And currently, a lot of the political debate is about electoral democracy only. So rural democratization and also, supporting non-electoral democracy, strengthening civil society strengthening democratic alliances in the rural area will be very important for Myanmar. I think I will stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sam. And let us go to the next speaker. Over to you, Shapan.
Hello, welcome everyone. Following from what Sai Sam has said, I will focus more on the way in which the military in Burma is deeply rooted into the structure of the state, and how and in what particular ways they have curbed or constrained the rights of the citizens of Burma over time. The military has been in control more or less since the independence of Burma in 1948. Even under the recent regime where Aung San Suu Kyi led the NLD government, the military were never out of power. They controlled the three major ministries. They had a big chunk of the parliamentary seats, enough to put a veto on any changes that they did not like. So the military were not out of power at any time, but as has been remarked, they did put on civilian clothes for a while to kind of say that, you know, we're not wolf, we're sheep, we're trying to graduate to a different kind of regime. But obviously, with the recent coup in the 1st of February, things have changed. And in a sense, the military has decided to show its power again. The power was always there, but it has become naked and brazen once again. Now, the citizenship laws in Burma under General Nevin and others constrained the rights of citizens in particular ways. In the 1982 citizenship laws divided the 100 and something groups, ethnic and racial groups of Burma into three categories of citizens, associate citizens, and others. And this kind of stratified regime of different categories of citizens also implied that those in the lower categories did not have the kind of rights that the upper groups did. And this afflicted many of the ethnic minorities, ethnic and religious minorities of Burma, and in particular the Rohingya, who were of course particularly marginalized and de-linked from the sense of belonging within the Burmese nation state. Now, if we look at the way this was actually done, it was not only through citizenship laws, but also the issuing of identity cards like the National Verification Card or Certificate, NVC, which the NVC, which the authorities insisted that the Rohingyas accept, was also linked to their access to livelihoods and markets. The very fact of accepting the NVC meant that the Rohingyas had to declare that they were Bengalis, and as soon as they said Bengalis, they were automatically unable to qualify as citizens of the country who had the rights to hold land. So it was a kind of interlocking grid of laws, certificates, identity cards, and regulations which systematically disenfranchised the citizenship rights of particular groups. This was also linked to other forms of livelihood. For example, the NVC was needed to have access to fishing. It was needed for access to forests, to have access to markets, to be able to go and to be able to travel from one point to another. So through this regime of manifold restrictions, what actually happened was that the state under military rule did not only curb the citizenship rights, but it also cut down and restricted the avenues of livelihood, of attaining food security, and the very survival of these groups. In conceptually, we can kind of think of this as forms of structural violence, violence which is not direct and visible, but which is inherent in the structure. And the structure was organized within the Myanmar state and also in terms of civil society relations in ways which systematically disenfranchised particular groups. The Rohingyas constitute the limiting case, but there are many other ethnic minorities in Burma which have also been disenfranchised to various degrees. There is also the practice of forced labor, where the military could walk into a village and pick up any number of people that they liked. They would take them to camps, they would make them do their work. They would not pay, they would not provide food. So this was unpaid labor. There are also instances where the military would actually demand that the people who've been taken as forced labor pay them instead. So instead of paying wages to the workers, they also extracted money from the people who had been forced to work. And this was the kind of ransom money, and families had to pay that money to get them out. So it was that kind of situation. And the limiting case of this, the IDP, the internally displaced people, some mentioned that there were 400,000 IDP in Burma. In the case of the Rohingyas, it was about 20,000 of the 120,000 among the 600,000 who still remain. And all the restrictions that I've talked about so far applied to them, but even more intensely than for the people who were living in villages. So the IDP camps were almost concentration camp-like situations where people were systematically kept, restricted, confined, without rights, and even if they were able to go outside, they had to pay bribes. If they went fishing, they had to pay a fish to the guards when they returned, and so on. And in effect, what the interlocking system of laws and regulations and local fiats by people in power, like security guards and so on, was to create a segregated society whereby particular groups were delinked from the rest of the mainstream society. And it was a kind of segregation which is not too unlike the apartheid that you've known in South Africa. But this was Burmese style. So in the case of the Rohingyas, we see that the state and its restriction of citizenship rights actually leads to apartheid-like situations. But this is not all. As Saisam has mentioned, in addition to all of this, there were systematic land grabs. And land grabs, in a sense, happens through the law as well as the use of direct force. The law, which was called the Vacant, Fallows, and Virgin Land Management Act, in short, the VFV Act, effectively gave the Burmese state the right to confiscate lands that it regarded as vacant, fallow, or virgin, irrespective of what really was the case. in the Arakan or Rakhine state, about 40% of such of the land was categorized in that way, and so people were at risk anyway from the laws which were passed. This was then uh, compounded by in the case of the Rohingyas in Arakan state, by the systematic repression and expulsion, the extermination and the expulsion of the Rohingya people. What that did was to leave huge tracts of land, some with many of much of which had standing crops, unattended. Um, Euphemistically, the Burmese authorities said that these are the lands where the people have left, without explaining how the people had been forced to leave. But these lands were then reallocated by the concerned authorities in Rakhine State. And here, an organization called the United Enterprise for Humanitarian Assistance, Resettlement, and Development. Uh, the acronym is UEHRD, but we can call it Union Enterprise for short. Now, this was an agency set up by the Burmese state, headed by none other than Aung San Suu Kyi. Its supposed job was to help rehabilitate the people who were the victims of violence, bring them back and settle them. In practice, what the Union Enterprise did was to take over the lands that had been left behind, including the crops in some cases, and redistribute those lands to others. Some of those lands were transferred to uh, uh, ethnic Buddhist groups like the local Rakhines. But in particular, what the Union Enterprise under Suu Kyi did was to hand it over to the crony capitalist companies, the crony companies as they're called. And this is a vast interlocking network of companies which are headed by the friends and family members of the Burmese military. And they have this peculiar parasitic relationship with the military. They are given contracts either directly by the military or through organizations like the Union Enterprise. And these companies, once they have been able to make profit, uh, have a charitable arm, which is called some kind of foundation or the other. And these foundations make donations. And guess what? The donations go to the military, sometimes to the organizations, sometimes to individual members of the top brass. So, what one sees is this very uh, uh, intricately and very densely interwoven relationships between the military and the businesses which are run by their families and their friends. And this is, as Saisam said, not entirely operating on its own. It is supported by international business partners, banks, in almost all the liberal Western countries, as much as the Southeast Asian and the East Asian major economies. So this is, I think, very important to emphasize that the military does not want to give up power in Burma because it has this tremendous hold on the economy, and it's not a competitive relationship, that it's not a competitive position in which they are operating. They have kind monopolistic control over vast tracts of the economy, and this allows them almost routine access to surplus. And this is a kind of income that they are unwilling to give up. And anything that threatens that position is something that will provoked the military to exert its power and to um, take over and lessen political rights as it finds it necessary. And this is exactly what we've seen with the recent coup d'etat, where there were apprehensions that the NLD government, which would be formed, which would have been formed, was likely to assert more independence from the military, curb its powers. What this meant was a threat to the enormous, almost unearned surplus and rent that the military extracted from this whole economic system, and they were unwilling to let that happen. Now, there has been, as Sai-san has mentioned, uh, so, movements towards resistance to what is happening in Burma today. And I think one of the healthier things that has been seen is that old lines of division have, to some extent, been questioned. For example, in the case of the Rohingyas, one of the tragic aspects of their situation was that it was not only the military, the state and the military apparatus which was responsible for their expulsion and extermination, but to a very large extent, um, sections of the Buddhist majority population also sympathized with that. Ironically, even the NLD under Aung San Suu Kyi did not differ with the military as far as the attitude to the Rohingyas was concerned. Now, given that background, where even the so-called opposition belonging to the civil society is not in disagreement with the military, with its absolute power and its ethno-religious and racist kind of inclinations. It is good to see, for one thing, that uh, Rohingyas have been joining the protest against the military in recent days, that they've come out on the streets with with the offer of joining the other ethnic groups, the other ethno and religious groups of Burma in the struggle against, to overthrow the military. Equally, some of the resistance groups have said that they realized that their position vis-a-vis the Rohingyas had not been appropriate, and they're willing to um, now rethink their position and think of a more united opposition to the Burmese military, which straddles the whole range of ethnic and religious minorities in Burma, including the Rohingyas. And I think that is a very healthy sign, and perhaps a sign of hope after decades of state control and state policies of destruction. Now, even though there is hope, one should also note in conclusion that the the enormity of the power structure of the military, as Sai-san has said, how it, the fact that it has been able to reproduce itself over nearly 7 decades now, from 1948 onwards, suggests that it has extremely deep roots in the soil. The way the Burmese state has been structured in the interest of the dominant Bamar group, but also the military as the kind of powerful apparatus that controls that state system, operating in alliance with the Burmese Buddhist nationalist groups like the Ma Ba Tha and the 969 movements. Uh, it is that complex um, alliance between the military, sections of the civilian leadership, including the NLD, and the Burmese Buddhist clergy, or at least its more extreme sections. It is that alliance which is the bedrock of authoritarian rule in Burma today. And it is not going to be easy to dislodge that. Uh, I do not know whether it will, whether it will be possible and how it will be possible. But if it has to happen, then you need a movement which challenges that alliance between the military, the civilian leadership, and the Buddhist nationalist clergy. I think that is the magnitude of the task of trying to bring about an end to authoritarian rule in Burma, and I leave you with that problem to grapple with. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shapan. Let us go to our next speaker, Fariba. Thank you.
Prepared this PowerPoint presentation and I'd like to share it. So I Kobe, can you please check if until I can share it or?
Keep trying, but you can also continue. It's loading, it's coming. I can see it. Whilst we wait, attendees, please post questions on the chat for our speakers.
So if it's like not possible to share, I can just continue like others did without the PowerPoint.
That will be fine.
Yeah, okay. So yes, thank you everyone for joining in today's webinar. And I would also like to thank PLAS for organizing this webinar and for the invitation to give this talk. My talk is I'm going to discuss, or I'm going to focus on two aspects. One is the Rohingyas' continued struggle for the recognition of their identity as Rohingya, and also and the second topic which I'm going to focus on is that what is happening at the Rohingya camps after the coup, or what people are thinking and what is going on there. And to discuss that part, I'll draw on some of the insights that we have gathered through our research that we have conducted in 2020 last year about the Rohingyas mental health challenges that the Rohingyas face in the humanitarian context in Bangladesh, and their so as well as the challenges that Rohingyas face in terms of their mental health and the challenges they face in accessing the mental health services in the humanitarian context in Bangladesh. So Bangladesh, Professor Adnan have already discussed about the Rohingyas issue and how they were deprived of the citizenship rights in Myanmar. And from the Bangladesh side, what we have observed is that there have been influx of Rohingyas from the Myanmar in different periods of time, like in 1978 and in 1991, when the military government in Myanmar carried out Operation Dragon King and Operation Clean and Beautiful Nation. The Rohingyas were violently pushed out and they took shelter in Bangladesh. And the largest influx so far has been the one in 2017 when there was violence was carried out by the military government at a huge scale, and almost 800 or more than 800,000 Rohingyas crossed the border and they took refuge in Bangladesh. So I'd like to point out this red line, which shows the border between Bangladesh and Myanmar. And this border was first drawn in colonial period to divide British Burma from British India in 1930s, and later it became an international border when the countries became independent in 1947 and 1948, respectively. So as I say, that I first wanted to discuss about the Rohingya struggle for their recognition as Rohingya, an ethnic group in Myanmar, and as citizens of Myanmar. And as since Professor Adnan have already discussed about the citizenship laws and how that deprive the Rohingyas and other ethnic minorities and how this worked, I'm not going to go into the details. Just wanted to emphasize the fact that the history of marginalization of the Rohingyas in Myanmar is actually intricately linked to the history of the military rule in Myanmar. So right after the independence in 1948, the Rohingyas were recognized as an ethnic population group that reside in Burma, and they were also eligible to receive national registration certificate. But it was after the military took the control that in 1962 that this status was revoked. And one more thing I'd just like to add to the because Professor Adnan have already discussed about it. Just one thing I would like to mention is that this non-recognition of the Rohingyas as an ethnic group in Myanmar is actually rooted in the colonial history because the first census that was carried out in Myanmar was in 1872. And at that time, the colonial administrators faced a huge problem to categorize the population, to approach this wide human diversity and to quantify them. And then they came up with the idea of race. And they came up with the idea to define race by language. And based on that, they defined there are 8 races in Myanmar and 135 original ethnic groups. And when this census was carried out in 1872, the administrators noticed that the language that Rohingyas speak are more similar to the Chittagonian language, and so they categorized the Rohingyas as Chittagonian. And Chittagong is the district which is part of Bangladesh now, and where the Rohingyas are currently taking refuge and living in the camps. So what is important is that this is still used. The census is still used as an evidence by the Myanmar military government to establish that the Rohingyas are not one of the original ethnic groups that resided in Myanmar. And so what's happening now is that now over 1.2 million of the Rohingyas are now living in Bangladesh, in the Chittagong district, in the largest in a camp, which is the fastest growing refugee camp in the world. And in this camp, we can see that Rohingyas are still struggling for recognition of their identity as the Rohingyas and as for the citizenship right. For instance, when I went for fieldwork in 2018, there was a grassroots level organization was created, which is called Arakan Rohingya Society for Peace and Humanity. And this organization was collecting all sort of identity documents of the Rohingya individuals and the families that they have, like those which were issued or that all belong to their parents and issued in 1960s or 1980s. And they were also documenting all types of evidences to claim their identity as a Myanmar national and as citizens, like land lease documents or voting card or these things. And Rohingyas also organized large-scale collective movements to establish their identity while identity in the camps in Bangladesh. For instance, because they organized a huge protest when Bangladesh government and UNHCR started to implement the biometricization process, and in the biometric ID cards, they only mentioned Rohingyas as forcibly displaced Myanmar population (FDMN), but didn't mention about their ethnic identity, which is Rohingya. The Rohingyas protested because they wanted their identity to be included, because for them, they think it is important to claim their rights in Myanmar when they go back to Myanmar to claim their citizenship right and make claim over their land. And they were partially successful in that movement because in the end, their identity as Rohingya was included in the data set, the biometric data set, but not in the ID card though. So moving on now, I'm going to discuss some of the findings that we have found while doing our research on the mental. Oh, sorry, here the slides are not moving. Okay, shall I just go carry on? We have moved to like 5 slides, but I can see that it's not showing in the. Okay. All right then. So yes, so our project on mental health access, we actually focused on mental health because there is a growing concern um, over the psychosocial vulnerabilities of the refugees in protected displacement. And while it is acknowledged that there is a significant need for mental health services in humanitarian contexts, to provide that service and the scale of the challenge to provide an appropriate service is still inadequately understood. So our research attempted to address this gap by doing qualitative interviews with both the Rohingya refugees and as well as the healthcare providers. What we explored are the factors that shape the displaced access to mental health care and identify the barriers and opportunities for improving mental health provision and support. So what we have found is that um, I mean, we were told by also by the service provider that while in the beginning there was a higher rate of post-traumatic stress disorder among the Rohingyas because of the traumatic experience they have, the trauma they have experienced and the violence they have experienced prior to their displacement, um, um, as well as during their flight, there was a high rate of post-traumatic stress disorder in the beginning, but in present days, more people are suffering from obsessive compulsive disorder, OCD, and depression and anxiety. And in our discussion with the Rohingyas refugees, we have also found out that apart from like almost 8 out of 30 interviewees mentioned about having traumatic experience and experience of violence induced by the military and the Myanmar police, but they were also affected by some of the factors that arise in their current living condition or encampment situation. Like many of them suffer from uh, stresses because of the poverty, shortage of food, poor living condition, lack of livelihood and restriction on mobility, insecurity or protection vulnerabilities. And moreover, in their narratives of suffering, we also found that people mention frequently about the feeling of helplessness and yearning due to the disruption in their social ties and also loss of social network and loss of support of the extended families and the loss of home and loss of land. In case of the Rohingyas, it's very important to emphasize that land is very important for them because many of them are farmers and they were attached to their land. And for them, it is important to not to just to go back to Myanmar, to go back to their land, which they have cultivated for the generation. And however, from all these narratives that we have gathered about from the Rohingyas about their mental stress and the underlying causes they think they have because causes for this mental stress, we have identified that uncertainty with the future has been a major stress factors among the Rohingyas. And service providers with whom we talked have also mentioned about that. So according to the service providers, that there is a fear of repatriation among the Rohingyas, and there are rumors of repatriation that often goes on in the camp. And because of this um, fear of, because of this repatriation and these rumors, Rohingyas constantly live in a unsettledness and uncertainty with their future. So but what is this rumors of repatriation actually means is that Rohingyas do want to be repatriated, but they want to be repatriated with the guarantee of safety, with the guarantee of citizenship rights. And because unless they're not guaranteed their citizenship rights, the cycle of violence and the cycle of displacement will continue. However, they have this fear of being repatriated forcefully, and which is not really unfounded because it happened before in 1991 and 1992 when the government of Bangladesh and government of Myanmar quickly agreed to a memorandum, and without involving the international community, the Rohingyas were repatriated, often involuntarily. So this rumor of repatriation often impacts their mental health, as well as, according to the service providers, during the hearings at the International Court of Justice, where a case has been brought against the Myanmar military for conducting genocide. When these times of the hearings come, the tension among the population inside the camp is become palpable, and they receive all kind of they receive calls from their patients, whom they call clients, to help to because they suffer from anxiety and all this. And this so the uncertainty with the future has come up strongly in all the accounts that we have gathered from the Rohingyas about their distress that they experience. For instance, a male interviewee mentioned that we have one demand, which is we want justice. We have filed a lawsuit at the Duniyar Adalat, by which he meant International Court of Justice. But we are worried as we still haven't got any verdict. Why can't we go back to our home? We don't want to stay in Bangladesh. I worry all the time about our future. What will happen to my children? And I'd also like to mention one of the quotes that we gathered from a person, and he was not an interviewee of our or didn't participate in our research, but we met him at the camp in church office where we were waiting to get permission to access the camp, and he was also waiting to get permission to get out of the camp to receive treatment. He was suffering from cancer at that point, and he told us that they tell me not to worry or think too much. How can I do that? I feel worried thinking of what if I cannot ever get back to our land? What if I die here? And then one day, if my family returns to Myanmar, I will be left alone in a foreign land forever. So this quote I'm mentioning because it powerfully captures the hope that the Rohingyas have to return to their land, as well as the constant fear they have, and the hopelessness as well that they have, and the uncertainty they experience with the future, what's going to happen. And this is the common experience and the feeling of the people who are living in this largest refugee camp. And I think it was powerfully articulated by this particular person because unfortunately the illness that he was suffering from. So I'll just quickly continue that what is going on now, like after the recent coup. So what is going on is that the fear and uncertainty with the repatriation and with the future both have amplified among the Rohingyas. And the Rohingyas do want to repatriate, but they do not want to return now while the military government is in power. And there is a fear kind of among the Rohingyas because they can observe that there is a lack of concern among the international community regarding the plight of the Rohingyas and regarding their safe return to Myanmar after the coup, as they're more focused about this pro-democratic movement. So although their experience with the under the rule of Suki and also NLD proved extremely disappointing for the Rohingyas. However, the recent coup has further shattered their hope of any hope they had to return. So so there is this hopelessness, but at the same time there is hope, what is mentioned by Sai Sam and also by Professor Adnan. The hope is in the fact that while there was a silence towards the violence that Rohingyas experienced on the part of the majority of the population in in Myanmar before, now this silence is being questioned. So pro-democratic protesters are reaching out to the Rohingya leaders, not only in the camp, but those who live in other parts of the world, like in Germany, Canada, and US. And so they are trying to connect with the Rohingya leaders to create a new platform to work together to overthrow the military rule. And the Rohingya leaders are also expressing their solidarity with the pro-democratic protesters, which they see an opportunity to become part of the larger nation and to, of course, overthrow the military rule. So here, I'll just mention some of the concluding remarks. That is, in conclusion, I'd like to emphasize that the marginalization, violence, and deprivation of the citizenship right faced by Rohingyas is linked to the history of military rule in Myanmar. And so far, the Rohingyas were living in Bangladesh. For them to return to Myanmar, minimal diplomatic progress has been made in creating a conducive environment for the Rohingyas to repatriate in Myanmar. And the international community has largely failed, to put any pressure on the Myanmar government to grant the Rohingya citizenship rights so far. And after this coup, we can see that there are global initiative and movements going on to end the military regime and discrimination in Myanmar. And these ongoing processes should incorporate and emphasize on the Rohingyas' demand for justice and recognition and their safe return to their home. And lastly, I just want to make another comment, but this is more for the scholars and activists, that we need to decolonize the history and historical research that is going on, that is being done on the Rohingyas. That's it.
Thank you so much, Fariba. Thank you so much, Japan and Saisam. We have gone over time, but we can have a look at a few questions. Of course, we cannot go through all of them because of time. So let us go to the first question. Pilan Zamchia is asking, does the military junta only use authoritarian repressive tactics, or it combines with ideological appeals? In Zimbabwe, the deep state uses coercion, patronage, and ideological appeal. And can we pose another question so that we go on? He continues, what can be done to enhance rural democratization in Myanmar? And let us have another question, please. And this one is from Divesh Roy. Our research as trade analysts show that sanctions have largely been ineffective, with strong evidence of sanctions busting. I beg your pardon. Will sanctions work? I guess no, unless it is comprehensive. Another one, please. And this one from Jujemisa, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. What are your thoughts in this development? Is it a performative act to achieve support by the UN, or is there remorse and acknowledgement of the Rohingya issue? Those are the questions that we have by far. Perhaps, Isam, you'd like to respond broadly to some of this, and then maybe you, Fariba, and Shapan. Thank you. Saisam?
Yeah, I was muted, sorry. Yeah, I would like to quickly go through that, talking about what are the ideological appeals. It is Buddhist nationalism. It's not only based in Buddhist, but also based in what we call Burma Buddhist nationalism. The Burma are the majority ethnic people who are also hugely controlling in the military. If you are from a minority ethnic group, if you are a minority religious group, you will not get promotion in many arena of government works, particularly in the military. So if you are from the ethnic group, I think the past years we have seen that you will get only up to the major level, but now only up to captain level. If you want to go through the military training, military academy, they have their own engineering school, they have their own medical school, and they have their own officers training schools, and all of that require that you have to be a Buddhist. Or most of the time, some people try to become a Buddhist, in order to get access to these kind of training and then the career and opportunity offered by that. And it's not only ideological appeal, it's also economic appeals. That the more you get higher up in the ranks and files, the more you can get access to resources, and also, I mean, a lot of very corrupted practices. You know, we have seen in the news that some military officers got arrested while they are doing the drug trades, drug trafficking, and sometimes also included in the armed trades to, you know, different parts of the world. So I would say ideological appeal as well as economic appeal is being used. I'm just going to quickly to the rural democratization in Myanmar. It's very much linked to the also to the social reproduction of the militarism and military dictatorship. The rural area is where the ethnic armed insurgent recruit them, and also the Myanmar military junta recruit their soldier mainly from these rural areas. So these are very important things that we have to address, and also including rural population who are poor also send their children to the Buddhist monasteries to get access to education. And then Buddhism is also kind of like a career ladder, you know. The more you are becoming prominent monks, you know, some monks that we know, for 1 hour sermons, they will get donation like 40,000 US dollars, for example. So you know that this is also kind of like a, you know, it is not well studied, but I am really interested to look into. I'm a Buddhist, by the way, but I'm really interested to look into the political economy of Buddhism in Myanmar. So this has not been, you know, this is a huge area that has not been studied. So what we are trying to do is also questioning the role of Buddhism. In the rural area, when you talk about democracy, when you talk about human rights, there is a lot of reluctance and sometimes resistance against these ideas. Rural population, one of the characters is, you know, it could be quite stereotyping, but largely true, is reactionary. You know, a lot of the supporter of Buddhist nationalist movement come from the rural area. So I would say, you know, talking about rural democratization in Myanmar, one of the arena is challenging the current teaching of Buddhism. You know, I still believe that Buddhism is relevant, you know, that there is a lot of good things that Buddhism is doing. To remember 2007 Saffron revolution led by Buddhist monk has shaped, you know, to the current political setting. So it's not a hugely successful, it was finally cracked down, but still it has a lot of positive political outcome coming out of that. But again, talking about Rohingya repatriation, talking about rural democratization, it's very important to understand the role of Buddhism in furthering the Burma Buddhist nationalism. And the other arena to address this is like rural election. A lot of the focus is on the general election, selecting who will become the president, who will become the member of the parliament. But there were also some rural level elections which were largely ignored by the civil society organization as well as political actors. So I think I would stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Fariba, maybe you have some closing remarks in relation to the questions that have been raised, and then we go to Japan. Please continue.
She was muted, I think.
Oh no, I say that no, the questions which were raised, actually, I think I cannot, you know, I don't have any reflection or comments on that, because I think Professor Adnan and Saisam were better person to reflect on this.
Should I speak?
Yes, please, Japan.
You can hear me, can you? Okay. Uh, some very interesting points have been raised. It's obviously not possible to answer all the questions. I'll take up a few points which I feel are important in terms of thinking about the future, what the problems are. One of the basic problems is how do you unite all of Burma uh, against the military, given the infinite divisions in terms of regions, ethnicities, religious affiliation, communities of faith, and so on. Just take one example. The Arakan army in Rakhine State has been involved in a insurgency war with the Burmese state and the military. Uh, the the Arakan army, their support base is the Rakhine Buddhist group in Arakan, which is the largest group. Uh, 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 just in Arakan, the Rakhine Buddhists are the largest groups, and then you have the Muslims, Arakanese Muslims, among whom Rohingyas are the largest group. So this was a situation where uh, the Arakan army and in support with the Arakan Nationalist Party, which was in control of the state legislature, had a kind of conflictual relationship with NLD and Aung San Suu Kyi's government. Now, one of the things that has happened after the coup, as far as I understand, is that the Arakan army, which had been banned as a terrorist group by the state and the military, that ban has been removed because they are supposedly um, not friendly towards the NLD and Aung San Suu Kyi. So, in that sense, they are acceptable to the military. So, that's just one example of the way there are these deep ethno-religious divisions within Burmese society, which make it very difficult to bring them together. Across Burma, in all the peripheral areas, you have conflicts between ethnic rebel armies, or what are called the ethnic armed organizations, EAOs, and the Tatmadaw, the Burmese military. Many of these you have ceasefire, so-called ceasefires, whereby there is a kind of coexistence between the Tatmadaw, the military, and the ethnic armed organizations. Now, some of these are in support of the military, and only some of them are not. Right now, I understand that the CPRF, the alternative government, has found some support among some of the ethnic armed organizations, but not all of them. So the question is, how do you bring all of them together? Then the question of the rural support base. Burma is not the only country where the peasantry and the sort of rural areas are in some ways more reactionary and provide a stronger support base for right-wing authoritarian governments. And so the question is, how do you transform that into something like a people's mobilization that you've seen in, say, Vietnam or China in earlier times? The question of Buddhism and Buddhist right-wing nationalist parties, the Maba Tha and the 969 movements, who have played a reactionary role not just in the Arakan and the Rohingyas, but across Burma, in the Burma's national politics. And as Sai Sam mentioned, they were actually calling for a coup d'etat before the coup d'etat actually happened. So now, as also Sai Sam said, there are positive elements within Burmese Buddhism, and as he rightly pointed out, there was a saffron revolution where the monks came out and were brutally crushed by this same army, the same military. Now, one of the things that you see in terms of historical developments is that during the latest NLD regime under Aung San Suu Kyi, the army and its party went uh, deliberately provided support to the Mabatha and the 969 movements. They provided them with money and with support. So what we see today is the result of deliberate policies by the military controlling state power in promoting certain extremist, reactionary, and intolerant varieties of Buddhism. That is not representative of all Buddhism, and there are moderate and more tolerant strands. The question is, how do you reverse this situation? Remember that Wirathu, the Buddhist monk, the right-wing leader, actually visited the Arakan twice in August 2017, just before the army crackdown. So it was not just the army operating there. It was supported by the right-wing extremist Buddhists, and Suki also held a meeting with top generals to control the situation in Arakan, and following which elements of the 33rd Brigade, the notorious 33rd Brigade of the army, were sort of airlifted into the Arakan. So it is, as I said, this combination of the military, of the Buddhist clergy, the right-wing Buddhist or religious organizations, and sections of the civil society, including the NLD under Aung San Suu Kyi. So, in terms of how do you change this situation, how do you bring about a restoration of democracy and people's rights? It is not going to be enough if the call is simply to restore the NLD and Aung San Suu Kyi, because if only that is achieved, you go back to the old equation. There is no fundamental change in the need for a less authoritarian, a non-authoritarian, a pro-democratic regime. And that is very important to remember, that it is not enough just to call for restoration of the civilian government as it was. It is much more necessary to have a fundamental rethinking about what democratic and participatory politics in Burma could and should mean.
Thank you very much for those remarks, Shapan. Attendees, we apologize sincerely for going over time, but please bear in mind that this is a special webinar, and we just have a few questions for Fariba. Fariba, there's a question for you from Mamata Pradhan. What is the explanation for this? What are the incentives for non-minorities to make choices as they do? After wars, countries get friendly if economic incentives are in line. And there's another one from Devesh Roy. Your study on Rohingya camps is very important. Once it is done, it will have great influence. Could you please respond?
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Devesh Roy. Thank you. And we are currently working on publishing a policy brief based on our research. And once we publish that, we will widely circulate. And we are meeting with the policymakers based on our findings and the recommendations to share with them the findings and the recommendation. So in answering to Mamata Pradhan's question, what? Yes, so as I understand, the question is that why the non-minorities or why the majorities are now trying to connect with the Rohingya leaders, or trying to create a platform, or showing solidarity, or addressing this long silence they had in terms with regard to the violence that the Rohingyas experienced for all these years. So is this it seems to me that the question is that what are the incentives for them to make the choices as they do? And after the worst countries get friendly if economic incentives are in line. Well, Well, it is, I don't know, like, I mean, it's hard to say that why the larger movement is now trying to incorporate the Rohingyas issues in their movement against the military government. I mean, as Sam was mentioning, that that this is quite a new movement in the sense that there are young generations who are now taking part, and probably they can see the long history of discrimination against different ethnic minorities and the classes, and want to address it as a larger nation. And I'm not sure about their incentives, though. So if Professor Adnan or Saisam can have any idea.
All right. Thank you so much, Fariba. We have gone over time by 20 minutes, and we sincerely apologize for going over time. And we have come to the end. I beg your pardon. We have gone over time, and we sincerely apologize for going over time. We have gone over time for over 20 minutes. And we have come to the end of this webinar. And we hope that it is not the last of the webinars that show international solidarity to the people of Myanmar. Those who have further questions can also contact us. Our next webinar will be on the 2nd of April, and it is exploring the question of, is the Traditional Court Bill necessary to enable access to justice for communities in former homelands of South Africa? That is next week at 1 p.m. So attendees, thank you so much. Saisa Kam, thank you for your time. Shapan, thank you so much for your availability. Fariba, thank you so much. Let us all stay in touch, and let us please share if there are any other international webinars of solidarity on the case of Myanmar. On behalf of the Institute for Poverty, Land and Agrarian Studies at the University of Western Cape, we bring this webinar to a close. Thank you so much.